are phenomenal places we all love to live in. And we all prefer for a good reason, because cities offer us better opportunities and choices. But how do we make these choices when we choose cities? If we look at the four fundamental factors, the way we make these choices to move in cities, the first one is job and livelihood. Where can you sell your skills decides what kind of city you. Second is affordability. What can you afford now that you have a job? What kind of lifestyle? What kind of lifestyle defines what kind of house do you want to live in? A tenement, an apartment, etc. What kind of land? What kind of social circle? What kind of amenities do you have? Views, vistas, parks, etc. And fourthly, it's environment and accessibility along with infrastructure. So which cities offer you a good environment, a good weather condition to live in? The one that has a place that is closer to your work, where you have good infrastructure for health, security, and education. Now, if you put all these factors together, we could be preferring any cities in the world, any large or major cities. You could be in Rio. Well, we know it's one of the best cities in Latin America. You could be in Nairobi. It's one of the financial capitals again. You could be in Cape Town, beautiful views and vistas. Or we could be in Lagos, also one of the harbors. And how do we forget Amchi, Mumbai? Right? These are amazing cities that any of us would prefer to live in. Now, what if we were born poor, we were in extreme poverty, and that we had no choice about, and we lived in villages? We would still want to move to cities and migrate in cities for the very same reasons, for the same four fundamental factors, but the equation changes this time. The factors remain the same, mean differently. Livelihood would here mean that I have very low skill sets. So what can I earn if I move to a city? I could be a daily wage laborer, could be a house help, a driver, a hotel worker, and anybody. Affordability. What can you afford if you just had a $2 income a day? Would you choose between to live on a pavement, or you would choose to live in a slum? And three, looking at location. Well, a poor person would look or seek in a city the safest location to be, where they have the least threat for eviction, and where the police cannot woo them away. And fourth, talking about environment, infrastructure, and accessibility, well, they really don't have much of a choice. They do prefer to live along the workplaces, but what they look for is, most importantly, basic services such as water and sanitation, that most of us take it for granted. Now, what this means is that we could be, again, in the same cities, but a bit differently this time. We could be in Vancouver, but we could be a homeless person in a tent. In the favelas in Rio, in Kibera, in Nairobi. It's one of the largest settlements in Kenya and also in Africa. In Mesakupulani, in Cape Town. Or in Mokoko, in Lagos, settlements in water. Or Dharavi, as we famously know, in Mumbai. Everything remains the same, but fundamentally, everything changes. So if you look at this, slums are cities in themselves. And globally, if you look at the UN Habitat, what it says is that about more than 40% of people in this world, especially in Asia, Latin America, in the global south, and Africa, are living in a ratio who earn between less than $2 to $3 a day. What that means is that about 860 people are living in poverty. To give you a perspective, that's about more than 2.5 times the population of the United States of America. And to make it much simpler, it's every eighth person that we know in urban areas is living in slums. Now, what does this mean for me, and why am I telling you? So I am an architect and an urban planner. And now what that means is that I study cities like the way a doctor studies the anatomy of a human body. And And urban planning is not a profession that we very commonly hear of. I mean, I don't know the last time I heard a kid saying that, hey, I want to become an urban planner when I grow up. And as a kid, I never did that too. So I was born and brought up in Mumbai. My father is a surgeon. I come from a family of medicine. And my father, out of his practice, he spent a lot of his time working in the slums of Mumbai. After my school, I grew up coming up with a lot of questions in my mind. I grew up asking, why do people live in such inhuman conditions? I had no answers to this. At this point in time, I did not know what I actually wanted to become. So I decided to work with a firm that would do designs for habitats in the poor. All that meant was that houses were so close to one another that there was absolutely no natural light and ventilation. And I felt betrayed, and I felt that what was I? I felt that this is not what I wanted to do. And the questions in my mind still remained unanswered. And that is where I decided that I wanted to pursue urban planning in order to understand the bigger picture, in order to understand the economies, the politics, and everything else that explains me why the situation is like. Now, well, fully equipped with this technical background, I pursued an urban planning from a very reputed university, and I thought that now I was ready to wet my feet in the ground. And I wanted to always work very closely to ground realities, and hence I chose to work with India's largest NGO that works on the fundamental that slum dwellers decide what they want. They know exactly what they want. It's called Spark, and it works in 9 states in India across 83 cities. And it works with slum dwellers, what they call as federations. And it is here, while working with them, with the poor, I realized how much I did not know. My entire technical education, my good 10, 15 years of education felt was wasted because it simply did not match the realities. However smart I thought the solution was, I was mocked at. It didn't work on the ground. What that means is this. Technical training and the formal training that we get in institutions trains us to think in clarity. It trains us to think in squares, in grids, in geometries, and clarity. But what happens in reality in informal settlements is this is chaos. And nobody trains us how to work in chaos. Now, if we were to do an X-ray, sorry, I use a lot of medical terms, comes from my family. So if we were to do an X-ray of a small section of a city, what that would look like is something like that. So the black are the buildings, and the white are open spaces. So technically, we call this as a Knowles diagram. It helps us understand how much is built and how much is open. Now, I thought I knew how to solve all the problems of design and planning in slums, but when I went on site, this is what I came up with. This means 1 + 1 is not 2. So this is where I underwent an entire process of unlearning of exactly everything that I had learned. If there was something that I was taught at school, I figured out that it didn't work in reality. What I want to talk here is about slums as ecosystems, and that it requires tailor-made solutions that only works for certain areas. We cannot use cookie-cutter approaches that we use traditionally in the formal setup. I'd like to talk about 3 fundamental aspects that the organization has worked on over decades and has become instrumental in changing the way the country and other countries have looked at. So first one I would like to talk about is a sense of identity. When poor people move in cities, we see them across everywhere, right? Under the bridges, along rail tracks. They don't have a sense of identity. So early in the 80s, what happened is that it was still a debate whether or not we should allow people to migrate in cities. It was still a debate whether pavement dwellers belong to the city. The question was that who does the city belong to after all? So pavement dwellers were never considered to be a part of the census because it does not recognize them to have a particular structure. There's no referencing. There is no house that you can mark them with. So for the first time ever in the history, the organization, the federations, did a survey of all the pavement dwellers in Bombay. And the way they did it was absolutely amazing. They came up with street lights to become the focal points to recognize where the structures are. And they made the first publication that had the first methodological survey of doing a technical survey, which was called We the Invisible, that was published. And then many other countries then looked up to this model and then have tried to do it differently. Now, what this also meant is that it changed the way the policies were designed in India. It included to have payment dwellers because these people haven't been living there for, say, a year or two. They've been living there for many years together. So you cannot exclude such a large population from the city when you're planning for them. The second one is on toilets. You know, for what most of us would consider to be luxury, having a toilet in our house, for a lot of other people, it means differently, especially in densities like this. Having a toilet is a big thing. What happens and where do you plonk your toilet if you have houses so close and if there are at least 10 people sleeping in every tenement? Houses being so close to each other had to come up with something else, something absolutely new. We always had public toilets, but most of us know what condition and state the operation and maintenance of public toilets are in the city. So what that meant is that for slum communities, especially in high densities, in metro cities in India, we required a new solution that was, again, tailor-made to work for the slums. What they came up with was a model which had a community toilet which was enmarked for a particular settlement, which identified the total number of people living in that particular settlement, men and women, and then based on that came up with a calculation for the total number of seats. Interestingly, the toilet was multifunctional. What they came up with was a separate room for the caretaker, because most public toilets are not functional because the caretaker is not there. It also allowed for the caretaker to have a place of his own, where he could keep his family. And in high-density areas, there are often no communal spaces. Also offered communal spaces for children to be on. Very interestingly, we only look for toilets for male and female section. But what we forget is children. In the morning hours, children cannot pace with adults. We all know that. So they designed a separate area for children. It was the first toilet of its kind to have done that. And they had women, especially, who are a part of the federation, who said that we would lead it and we would do it because contractors were doing a bad job. So they designed the funicular roofing and all kinds of materials that they required and also constructed these toilets. And interestingly, this set up a new milestone, and they've replicated thousands of toilets, not only in India with this particular model, but also have replicated in more than 30 countries across the world. The third thing I would like to talk about is housing. We know for some of us who probably have seen slums that the houses are very small. They are probably less than 10 square feet, 100 square feet, 10 by 10. Now, there are policies that are designed for housing, which says, there was one that said the BSUP policy, which came about a few years ago. And it said that everybody who lives in a slum would have a subsistence allowance that would be given in order to build their own house over a period of time. But the policy had a glitch. It said that only houses that were more than 100 square feet would be allowed to take this money. Now, what that meant is that there were a lot of people who would not be allowed in this. So we came up, this is just one example from a project I'm talking about. We came up with a list of all the houses and marked them with people to find that all the ones in brown are the ones that did not fit in this criteria. Should we exclude them from the policy just because their houses are not within 100 square feet? That wouldn't be justified. So what they did is that they came up with clustering, and they clustered groups of families together, and then they came up with models like this. These models then were put into practice and they were executed to make sure that everybody in the settlement had a house. Now, these are just a few examples that I could show. And there are many, many more stories I could go on if you put me on a soapbox, and they have been done over many, many countries. What I have learned in my journey is that slums are ecosystems, and they needed to be included in the city. What looks like a problem, actually a solution for the other few. What I have understood is one thing, is turning point is not when you make a choice of a career. It is when you hear a calling. It is when you go and follow this calling, and that career just follows behind you. It is what matters more than money. Thank you.